the Transition Plan Taskforce was asked by the UK government to create a framework. We published that disclosure framework last year. It centres ambition, action and accountability.
Hello and welcome along to this Lloyds Bank Credible Transition Plans in Practice video series hosted in association with Edie. I'm your series host and Edie's publisher, Luke Nicholls. And in this series, we are going to be sitting down with industry leaders across business, academia, policy and investment to discuss the real-world implications and transformative power of credible transition plans. In this episode, we'll be giving you a much-needed introduction and a full explainer into exactly what credible transition plans are and how businesses can be developing and implementing them to their advantage. And I'm delighted to help us do that by two special guests, Kate Levick, co-head Secretariat for the Transition Plan Taskforce, and Jonas Persson, the Managing Director and Head of Sustainability and ESG Financing for Lloyds Bank. Kate, I'll start with you. Perhaps you could just kick off by breaking down exactly what a credible transition plan is and where the Transition Plan Taskforce sits against this.
Sure. Well, the Transition Plan Taskforce was asked by the UK government to create a framework for best practice, robust and credible climate transition plan to be disclosed by any company from any sector. And that's what we did. We published that disclosure framework last year, and it's been pretty well received by market and by regulators and so on. So we think we did a decent job on that. It centres ambition, action and accountability as the three key principles. The framework's pretty simple. It runs through 5 key elements of a transition plan. And those start with foundations. This is about your ambition and setting your targets. They move through to implementation, to engagement. Engagement with stakeholders is extremely important to have a really robust and credible plan, and then moves through to specifically looking at the metrics and targets, and then at the governance that an organisation has around its plan.
So I want to find out then, in terms of how mandatory or not a transition plan is for any organisation, where are the sort of lines drawn? At what point does this kind of document, if you like, become mandatory?
Sure. So when the government in the UK created the Transition Plan Taskforce, this was at COP26, they also said that they were going to require companies to disclose climate transition plans. And even though we have a new government now, they're still moving towards putting that requirement in place. But actually, companies don't have to wait for transition plans to be a mandatory requirement. Many companies are already creating and talking about their transition plans. And, we're seeing some companies now that are, not even on their first transition plan, and they've already started to revisit and refresh their transition plans.
Okay, and so where do credible transition plans sit then against the plethora of other reporting frameworks and standards that now exist?
Sure. Well, it's important to say, first of all, that transition planning is part of business strategy planning. So, it shouldn't be only seen as an end-of-pipe reporting issue or a compliance issue. It goes right up to, the business strategy planning process. But then when you look at other frameworks for other types of environmental sustainability disclosures, it fits in very well. And we worked hard in the TPT to make sure that we were drawing on other frameworks as much as possible, that it would fit right into the kind of reporting activities companies were already doing and basically create as little additional burden as possible. And we looked across different international frameworks to try and make sure that that was true not only in the UK, but for companies trying to respond to requirements from other jurisdictions as well.
Okay, and Jonas, you've been sitting patiently there. It's time to bring you in, I think. From your perspective at Lloyds Bank, how can credible transition plans be effectively integrated with existing client plans and with things like net zero targets?
Yeah, I think first of all, to emphasize Kate's point, this should not be something that sits separately on the side. It should be absolutely part of the corporate group strategy overall. So it has to be in one place. If it's not, I don't think it will be taken seriously. So I think that's something that has to be really, really considered when you do this. But also understand, to Kate's other point, is that this is a process where you do the foundation, and that's going to tighten up over time, make sure that the ambition is kind of developing in line with the program as well. So I think that's something to consider.
And Kate touched on these kind of the 5 key elements that would make up a transition plan, one of them being engaging others in the company. Wanted to dig into that a little bit and find out how then can credible transition plans be used as an engagement and buy-in tool, both internally among the staff and board, for example, and externally, investors and customers.
Yeah, so, well, if you don't mind, I think it's on this side. Obviously, investors, we're looking at both equity and debt investors. It's a real opportunity to showcase to the investors what it is you're doing. You will expect that investors are really keen to understand what the corporates are doing to make sure they're kind of protecting themselves, developing the credible transition plans accordingly, which is really critical for the companies in order to secure the longevity.
And Kate, I mean, on an internal perspective, can these documents be used in ways and developed in ways that can create buy-in, whether that's staff outwards and maybe upwards with the CEO and board?
Yeah, I mean, what we've heard many times from companies that have worked to put transition plans in place is that this creates an incredibly useful process for bringing the company together around how climate fits into their business strategy. Creating a robust, credible transition plan involves bringing together different parts of the company that may not have worked together before. This can't all sit with the sustainability team. You need to bring in finance and risk and business marketing and many other functions. And of course, going back to that fifth element, the governance, this is a strategic plan. It needs to have support and sign off at board level.
If I may come in on that, and I think that's something that we who've been a part of this process for a period of time, taking us back a couple of years ago when corporates were quite keen on sort of publicly communicating bold ambitions in sustainability and net zero. And then after a couple of years, or the period since, is that corporates have started to develop the credible transition plan. How do we take that ambition? How do we kind of develop the strategies, understand what the levers are, what the actions are in order to deliver against those targets? I think we find ourselves in a place now where this is getting quite tough. And I think companies and businesses, they want to be ambitious. I think that's in their nature. But they also want to be absolutely certain that they can deliver on the targets. So I think there's a little bit of I want to call it a conflict, but there's a little bit of a gap between the ambition and the credibility of delivering against those targets. That's something, and therefore I do think it's important that sort of support and from the board and senior managers needs to be there. Because if you go to the business itself, that might be wrestling with very challenging other sort of priorities for the company, its productivity, its returns, etc. They need to have that sort of support, that there may be trade-offs in the short term, and they have to be well identified. Otherwise, there's going to potentially be conflict within the institution.
Yeah, I think we're going to get into that kind of ambition gap later on in this series. I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that. But a couple of areas I wanted to delve into now, if I may. One was around compliance. And we'll come on to the policy point as well that I'd like to get into in a moment. But on the compliance side of things, I could probably guess the answer to this one, but should we really be looking at credible transition plans as a compliance exercise, or is this really about value creation and opportunity?
So this is about making your business fit for the future. And in that sense, it should absolutely be seen as an opportunity story. This is how the business will grow and thrive through the transition that the economy is going to have to make, and then be fit for that post-transition world.
Jonas, any further comments on seizing the kind of opportunity of this beyond just complying?
Well, it certainly is. It is absolutely to understand what the opportunity is. If you look at identifying what they are for the institution, but also being aware of where the challenges. And it's not meant to be that each institution is going to solve all problems. But if we collectively manage to shine the light on those challenges that needs to have additional support, that's a good outcome, I think.
I think so. And if I can just build on that a little bit, part of what we recommend in the TPT framework is that companies should be open and talk about their dependencies. That means what they need others to do in order for their transition plan to be possible. And that might involve customers or staff or other industry peers. It may also involve governments and policymakers and regulators. And they can actually take steps to ensure that some of those dependencies actually go the way they need them to go. So planning for transition as a part of it is actually planning how they'll do that engagement.
Yeah, really good point. Right, policy. Now, I know we could spend probably an entire episode talking about the policy that sits behind this, but obviously in the context of the new government here in the UK, I wanted to just get your views on the role of policymakers in ensuring that credible transition plans can actually lead to real change that we all want from businesses. Kate, I'll start with yourself.
Sure. Well, I mean, when it comes to transition plans, people first think about whether there's a requirement to make a transition plan for a company, and we do expect that to be coming down the line soon. But actually, the key role of government is to set out what the overall transition looks like for the economy, set out those national signals. So we're coming into an important COP meeting next year, the International Climate Talks. And in 2025, countries have been asked to come from all over the world with enhanced nationally determined commitments, so making their own plans and targets more ambitious to make it more likely we'll meet those Paris goals. And when they do that, they set out all the different policies, where they see their economy going. And companies, really need to see the government send those signals, and then they can design their transition plans in a way that fits and that understands what policy signals are coming down the line.
Jonas, what's your view on the sort of interconnection between business and government over there?
It's signalling that really does matter. I think corporates, industries have evidence that they can change and adopt change as long as they're given certainty and kind of lead way up to change. Then I think they can make those changes. So I think that is definitely critical to do that.
Okay, so covered off a fair bit of ground in a short space of time here. My last question was just about what happens next once an organisation has hopefully developed a credible and ambitious transition plan. Are these documents all about continuous improvement? And if so, what does that kind of look like?
Sure. So a transition plan is not a one-off thing that a company would do. This is a forward-looking exercise, and we all know that plans change. So we can't expect everything to go as planned, and it would be a normal expectation that companies will revisit their transition plan and refresh it. In the TPT, we recommended they do that every 3 years. It may depend on the business circumstances, but this is the same as the normal business strategy planning cycle.
Jonas, I mean, building on that, any kind of final reflections from yourself?
Well, I want to come back to the point we mentioned earlier, is transparency. I think it's an important thing. You talk about the sort of review of it, of the credible transition plans, because things do tend to change. And I don't think any sort of strategy is going to be always static. We will have to accept that there will be changes, and there will be new people in companies. There will be new opportunities to do different things. And there's always technical and innovation advantages, and we need to incorporate that in strategies going forward too.
I am going to have to draw this conversation to a close, and indeed this first episode of this ongoing series to a close. A huge thank you to Kate and to Jonas for giving us this much needed introduction to the series and overview of what credible transition plans are. Stay tuned for the remainder of the episodes in this series, and in the meantime, if you'd like to check out the reporting versus reality report that Lloyds Bank have compiled, which underpins a lot of the themes we're going to be covering in this series, please do that by searching for Lloyds Bank Credible Transition Plans or going to lloydsbank.com/credible-transition-plans. So until next time, goodbye.